I'd like to welcome each one of you to our devotional study today. I invite you to take your Bibles, come with me to 1 Timothy chapter 3. As you turn into 1 Timothy chapter 3, if you didn't already know, it becomes increasingly clear as we study through 1 Timothy that proper behavior in the house of God is of utmost importance. It is important to God and it ought to be important to us. As a matter of fact, the whole in the middle of 2 Timothy 2, 3, and 4, which all deal with behavior in the house of God, it says in verse 15, "But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is a church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth." As we've been journeying through 1 Timothy chapter 3, we see here that it talks about the qualifications of Christian elders, of church elders. And as we come into this passage in verses 1 through 7 of 1 Timothy 3, we see here the qualifications of bishops. Yesterday we saw that bishops and elder and pastor is a interchangeable word for the exact same office, and what each word does is it shows us a little different aspect of that office. As a matter of fact, we even went to a verse or two in which those words are used interchangeably. So we're looking at the qualifications of pastors. Let's read once again 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. "This is a true saying, if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, a husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous. One that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must have a good report of them which are without, lest he fall into reproach and snare of the devil." So we have already looked at verse 1. If a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. And we looked a little bit at that verse yesterday. Today, as we get into the qualifications of bishops or of pastors, we see in verses 2 and 3 that it talks about his personal life, and that's what we want to deal with today as far as these qualifications are concerned. First of all, as you come into verse 2, it says, "A bishop then must be blameless." That word blameless in that verse means above reproach. He must have a good testimony, not only in the church, but also in his home and in the community. As we think about this idea of being blameless, come with me, if you would, to 1 Timothy chapter 5, and in verse 7. It says, "And these things give in charge, that they may be blameless." So once again, we see here, and this ought to be the desire of every child of God, that we would be blameless, that we would be above reproach, that we would have a good testimony. 1 Timothy 6 and verse 14 says, "That thou keep this commandment without spot, unrebukable, until the appearing of Jesus Christ." So we should desire to have a good testimony before all until the appearing of Jesus Christ, or until we die and we appear before him. So we see there that he needs to be blameless, but then it says the husband of one wife. Now, this right away includes the celibacy of the Roman Catholic priest. It is wrong for them to say to their priests that they cannot be married, for one thing, but then beyond that, we need to understand that this does not exclude a single guy from serving. Sometimes people will look at this and say, well, if somebody's single, they can't be a pastor. No, that's not what it's saying. What it is saying, though, is that if there's a woman in his life, it's giving some very clear criteria in that regard. It excludes those who divorce and remarry. Some people get around that by saying, well, it's just talking about polygamy. But that's not the case, because this cannot refer to polygamy, since no man who was married to more than one woman at a time would even be allowed to be a member of the church. So obviously it's not talking about polygamy here, and excluding people that are married and divorced from being a pastor. Also, we see here very clearly that it excludes a woman from being a pastor, because she obviously cannot be a husband of one wife. But as we look at this phrase, the husband of one wife, I want you to understand that this is literally talking about someone that is a one-woman man. It's not a man that is given to flirting with women that are not his wife and things of that nature. It's a man that is truly given to one woman and to one woman only. Then we see in verse 2 that he is to be vigilant. That word vigilant is elsewhere translated sober. And it carries with it the idea of abstaining from wine. And then you notice the next word is sober. And sober in this verse does, many times today we think of that as not being controlled by wine. But the word sober also can mean temperate or discreet. As a matter of fact, Thayer said this about this word sober. He says it means of sound mind, sane in one's senses, curbing one's desire and impulses, self-controlled, temperate. So there we see that sober means that he's a guy that is able to control himself. He's a guy that is able to curb desires. And then we see of good behavior. As you look at that very simply, that means orderly and modest in the way that he lives his life and the way that he dresses, things of that nature. Given to hospitality. Very simply, as we look at given to hospitality, it means that kindness and generosity is in view. And then he says here, apt to teach. That means that he is skilled in teaching, but this idea of apt to teach is the result of someone that is being apt to learn. They are eager to learn. Then we see here, not given to much wine in the beginning of verse 3. And according to William Patton, that literally means not at, by, or with wine. So, again, it goes kind of along with what we've already looked at as far as vigilant and sober is concerned, that he's able to control those desires and that he's not around wine, he's not near wine, he's not given to alcoholic beverages. Then it says in verse 3, no striker. That simply refers to violence or being pugnacious, contentious, or quarrelsome. A pastor is not a striker. He's not greedy of filthy lucre. That very simply means that he's not greedy for money. He's not in it for the money. And then beyond that, we see that it describes him as being patient, not a brawler. Vine says this idea of being patient and not a brawler, carries with it the idea of someone who is long-suffering toward people, someone who does not get angry with people, and someone who's not looking for a fight, is not quarrelsome, as we've already mentioned. And then it also says here that he is not covetous in the end of verse 3. And many times when we think of covetous, we immediately think of money, don't we? And certainly when we think of somebody who is not covetous, we understand that he is referring to money. It's referring to somebody that is not a lover of money. But it's popular, or I shouldn't say it's popular, it's possible rather, for preachers to covet things other than money. It's possible for people to covet things other than money. And he's telling us very clearly here that we are not to be covetous. You say, what could we covet? Well, a preacher can covet popularity. He can see somebody that's maybe a little bit more popular than he is, and it would bother him, and he could get to the place that he could covet popularity. You can covet fame, or you can covet a large ministry. Being in a smaller church, you could look at a bigger church somewhere and think, man, I'd like to have that bigger church. I would love to have a church like that. We need to be careful. Preachers need to be careful that they are not a people that are given to covetous. So this was looking at it very quickly today, but I do encourage you to take what's been said, and you can go back through 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 2 and 3 yourself, and you can look at these qualifications of a pastor, particularly in his personal life. Now let me say this as we close. These are not only things that are important for a pastor, but really what we're looking at here is nothing extreme or out of the way. It is very simply some good ethic for any child of God that we would have as these characteristics a part of our life, that these things would be true of us. So let's desire them not only for our pastors and for those who are in leadership, but let's desire that these things would be a part of our life as well. Really, it's an evidence of the fruit of the Spirit and Him working in us, which ought to be something that all of us long for in our lives. Have a great day.